moved into our home in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, a town in the northern part of the state, around 5 years ago. The move took place in the same week that we buried my wife's uncle in upstate New York, where he had lived part of each year. My wife was unexpectedly made executor to her uncle's will. He had died suddenly from heart disease in China, where he spent part of every year with his Asian wife. The executorship carried with it a good deal of responsibility that my wife wasn't anticipating, and at times not sure she could truly handle, such as selling her uncle's home and talking to and making funeral and burial arrangements with a number of his friends and his widow. It was shortly after her uncle's death that my wife started having odd experiences in our new home. We were told our house was built in 1752, which for reference was just 3 years before the birth of the last Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, 10 years before the reign of Catherine the Great in Russia, and 8 years before the reign of the Mad King George III, who ruled England during the time of the Revolutionary War. In what is now the United States, our house was built 2 to 4 years prior to the 7-Year War, which preceded the Revolutionary War. While the house is one of the older buildings in Chelmsford, information about it is curiously not included in the Chelmsford Historical Society, the headquarters of which is around the corner from where we live. We know that 2 prominent families, the Parkhursts and the Mansfields, lived in our house at least as far back as circa 1780, as the placard on the front of the house tells us. A book has been published about Chelmsford that shows pictures of members of the Parkhurst family, as well as members of another significant family in early Chelmsford, the Byams. Family members were described as church-going and musical, enjoying picnics and rides in horse-drawn carriages and the first automobiles in the early 20th century. There are pictures of family members who served in the Civil War as well.
A gentleman from a pest control agency who mentioned that he had a collection of old books gave us a couple that he said belonged in our house. One of the books of children's stories says, Laura Dutton, from her social studies teacher, A, period, and then some initial we actually can't figure out, period, Parkhurst, December 25th, 1889. The other book has no inscription. We read the stories in the Parkhurst sign book, known as Sidney the Fisherman and Miss Estelle. These were wholesome and very entertaining with nice illustrations. While we don't have access to nearly as much history as we might otherwise have hoped, we do know that the house had served numerous purposes over its 268 years, including being a farmhouse and a possible temporary refuge for Revolutionary War soldiers. The original kitchen of the house is now a dining room. It has a fireplace, one of 5 throughout the house, having served as the original cooking area. The more modern kitchen sits off the dining room, and it has a back staircase leading up to one of 2 small guest rooms.
These 2 rooms are separated by what is now a bathroom. The bathroom has a fireplace, which we assume suggests the rooms may have once been adjoined, serving as a possible servants' quarters. Or perhaps the rooms were always separate and the fireplace was part of a central parlor or meeting room. The guest rooms are aligned with 2 larger bedrooms. This is our daughter's room. And this is our master bedroom across a very short hallway over here. This style of architecture, with a suite of rooms adjoined, is known as an enfilade. It is characteristic of European architecture from the Baroque period, which was at its height in Europe from the early 17th century until the 1740s. We had visited the Lizzie Borden house in Fall River, Massachusetts, and found the upstairs bedrooms to be similarly aligned in this way. The Lizzie Borden house, for comparison, was built in 1889. This was the site of the infamous accused hatchet murder of Lizzie Borden's father and stepmother. Lizzie Borden was suspected of murder, but eventually acquitted, although she remained a town pariah until the day she died. The case had received tremendous notoriety because it was the very first time a woman of Lizzie's social stature was accused of such a violent crime.
Our house originally had a friendly, inviting aura when we first moved into it. Otherwise, we believe it's fair to say we would not have moved into it. The attic was and is a really big area, really big space. It could essentially serve as another bedroom if we were so inclined to turn it into one. We keep books and old toys and old furniture up there, and we rarely use it as anything other than what attics are traditionally used for, storage. Interestingly enough, an electrician that we had hired a couple of years ago claimed that he had been afraid to go up into our attic when none of us were at home. He said that he felt a presence up there, but he said after he had some kind of conversation with it that went away, and he was able to work alone from that point onward. We personally never experienced anything out of the ordinary up in the attic. We do remember there being some figures of angels and other religious items that had apparently been left behind by former residents. A Zillow photo of one of the rooms in our house a few years ago had shown a cross hanging on one of the walls, which to us just suggests that there were religious people living in the house, and we basically leave it at that. But we did have some interesting experiences. The first not easy to explain experience that we had was when I was doing late night work at the kitchen table, sometime past midnight. This was about a week or so after I had buried my uncle and after we had officially moved into our home. The sensation was a lock of my hair being lifted up off of my head. There was a moth seen flying around at the time, but I argued that the moth was unlikely to have been strong enough to lift a whole lock up of my hair. I quickly packed up my things and decided I had done enough for the night, and I ran upstairs. It was a very long time after that I resumed doing any late night work in our kitchen. Not long after that incident, our family was sitting in our family room, just a few feet away from the kitchen table. We were sitting only inches apart. I said that I smelled two very pungent waves of something that smelled like sulfur or rotten eggs, or maybe mold, or maybe a mixture of all three. Neither my husband or our daughter smelled anything, and I described the smell, especially the second time around, as being so strong it was actually offensive. It didn't seem like anything I would have readily attributed to another human being. I also had the same interesting experience with a friend of mine when we did visit the Lizzie Borden house. It was when we were both standing across from the couch that the father had been found murdered. There was another person in the room at the time. It was a woman that was sitting on the couch, and we experienced the same two consecutive waves of something that smelled like sulfur or rotten eggs or mold. But this time, I wasn't the only one that smelled it. Both I and my friend smelled this. I and my friend figured that it most likely was maybe from the woman who was sitting on the couch on the other side of the room. But again, we agreed that the smell was not like anything we would have readily attributed to another person. My friend and I checked the overstuffed refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen in the Lizzie Borden house. This was a kitchen right next to the room where the couch was, where the father had gotten killed. We figured maybe guests had been in there opening up the refrigerator, and maybe that's what we were smelling. Maybe it was rotten food coming from the refrigerator. But when we opened up the refrigerator and we checked, we smelled just regular food, nothing out of the ordinary. The smells of mold, rotten eggs, or sulfur and spoiled food are reputedly associated with unhappy, unfriendly spirits, or even demons. I never had this experience again in our house, and we haven't been back to the Lizzie Borden house since that one time to tempt fate. We don't know what the source of the smells were in either incident, and we still find it curious that my husband and my daughter's olfactory senses didn't actually pick up what almost made me pass out in our family room. That said, we aren't ruling out the possibilities that I and my friend may have coincidentally had like a temporal lobe seizure at the time of our visit to the Lizzie Borden house, or more likely it was maybe sewer gas through plumbing, or maybe gassing from drywall made in China, decayed vegetation and groundwater associated with wells. We'll really possibly never know. We do have an old well in our backyard, but it hasn't been in use for many, many years. In one of the guest rooms, we have what we now call our ghost windows. There were two fairly old windows facing out toward the roof of our garage. As far as we knew, these windows had been there for years. In two separate incidences spanning about a month, the windows popped out of their panes. There were a few odd things about this. Number one, despite how the panes lay on the outside of the lattices, they popped paradoxically into the house instead of out onto the roof. Number two, in at least one case, the glass landed on a hardwood trunk, but it was undamaged. 3, we don't remember either day being particularly windy. And 4, we can't understand why the windows popped out so close to each other after being there for so many years intact. Our neighbor, who was a carpenter, was very perplexed about this, and he couldn't explain it. Actually, he was the one that dubbed our windows the ghost windows. There seemed to be a lot of strange occurrences in our daughter's bedroom. She was afraid to sleep on her own for a number of years when she was younger, and I would actually lay on her floor near her bed on a mattress until she fell asleep. I called it my nest. I would routinely feel small shock-like sensations on my arms and legs, but I also would often feel touching sensations that at times I was convinced were my daughter trying to get my attention. But when I turn around to look in my daughter's direction, she'd be sound asleep on the complete other side of her bed. There was no way she could have been touching me and touching me in such a way as to then go to the other side of her bed and then fall asleep. I would often run into the master bedroom where my husband was, and I would tell him that the touching sensations were happening again. This happened nightly. We believe it could have been as long as a half of a year. We noticed nails in the hardwood floors that we wonder to this day may have somehow created some kind of static electricity or some other kind of electrical charge that might have been responsible for my sensations as well as other experiences that we had as a family unit. For instance, there was a green touch lamp that was on the opposite side of the room from where our daughter's bed was. When my husband would wish me and our daughter a good night, he would tap on the plastic panel of the light to turn it off. Usually between 5 to 10 minutes later, and almost every night, the light would turn back on, to the point where it actually became somewhat of a running joke between the three of us. I and my daughter would call out to my husband, and we'd say, "The lamp came on again." My husband would walk in, laughing. He'd turn it off, and it would generally never turn on a second time, and this did not occur during the day when the light was off. It's possible that I and or my daughter were lying where we were every night in the same place, and this could have created a one-time static charge that built up in just a few minutes and caused the light to routinely go on at the same time each night. However, we have no proof of this. Another example has to do with toys in our daughter's room turning on by themselves. My work desk used to be in the family room on the first floor of the house. There was one time when I was working at my desk alone in the house, and I heard talking coming from upstairs. I went upstairs to find a toy in our daughter's room that had come on all by itself. It was a Halloween toy, a little person wrapped up like a mummy in toilet paper that sang a song. I had thought that the toy was turned off, but for some reason it came on without anybody being around to turn it on. There were other toys of her daughter's that would spontaneously turn on with no one around, like a toy sword that made a fake metallic noise. Back on the first floor of our house, experiences included a candle holder in the family room that fell not once but twice, and also an exploding light bulb in the kitchen ceiling. I would sometimes sleep on the couch in the family room when it was too warm to sleep upstairs. I once heard the sound of footsteps going up and down the back stairs, but I also heard footsteps going down the front stairs at least once. I believe that the footsteps that I heard on the front stairs were so authentic that I assumed that someone would be standing there at its base, but no one ever showed up. I texted my husband to see if anyone was in the hallway at the top of the stairs or on the stairs themselves. My husband read my text and he got out of bed and he checked, but he didn't see anything. Another strange experience was when I was talking to my mother. I was sitting next to my computer and I saw a large flutter of light, and it wasn't exactly in my direct vision, but it wasn't completely in my peripheral vision either. My father, the brother of my deceased uncle, had recently passed. I had seen flutters of light like this occasionally when I was sitting at my desk when it was on the first floor of the house, but they were almost always exclusively in my peripheral vision. It should be mentioned that the night after my father died, when I was visiting my mother in Florida in her villa and we were preparing for the funeral, both I and my mother saw a similar flash of light together. This was followed a few seconds later by a flickering of a nightlight in the hallway. My mother said that she has never seen the hallway light flicker before or since. There were also a few seeming coincidences that occurred after my father had passed. This has nothing to do with our house, but I figure that they may be worth mentioning anyway. My father had been in the family candy and tobacco wholesale business, and he was a CB user back in the day when it was popular. His CB handle was Candyman. I had suggested that Candyman be written on my father's tombstone. However, the funeral director said that there wouldn't be enough room on the headstone to include it. We were donating boxes of books that my husband and I had published to a library in Pennsylvania. They needed to be mailed out. One of the books that we were donating had actually been dedicated to my father, to Poppy Joe. When my husband was entering the post office to mail a couple of boxes of these books, he noticed the song Candyman was playing on the radio. He hadn't had the chance to finish mailing all the books in the same day, and so he had to return to the post office a second time to finish the mailing. The song Hey Joe was playing when my husband walked in. My father's name, as I just mentioned, was Joe.
They kept on looking for a sign in the middle of the night, but I couldn't see the light.